Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here, and I thought it would be a good idea to, I hope I'm not black and white there. Okay, there we are right there. Great, great. I thought it would be a good idea to my friend and resident colonial historian, Jay Mandresh, on here, because I wanted to discuss the historical militia, because I believe that all too often, especially now, the militia is equated with terrorism and hate groups and white supremacy, when in fact the historical militia really is what is responsible for our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our modern day structure in government. So to help us understand this is Jay Mandresh. He is the founder of The Day. He's got his own little YouTube channel here. I don't have a link in the description, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it. You can also check out all of his stuff at founderoftheday.com. He goes live several times a week. Sometimes they're posted, but he really likes the interaction. Jay Mandresh, how are you this afternoon, sir?
I'm great, Jason. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, of course, why don't you tell people how you got into this whole thing, what your background is, why people should actually listen to you, and what you have to say about colonial America, and then we'll get into the basics of what the original militia was in this country.
Absolutely. Well, about myself, was a history nerd for a long time and studied a lot. You're using the word colonial. I should probably correct you. I'm infatuated with the American Revolutionary period and the founding period, which does a little bit cover the colonial time, but for the most part, I like to study the years 1762 to 1826, which I know sound obscure, but I have my reasons. So for any of your viewers who like the American Revolution, feel free to come over to Founder of the Day. And actually tonight, like all Friday nights, we're playing trivia. So 8:15 Eastern Standard Time. If you like the American Revolution, come take a guess. We're giving away a Paul Revere shirt this week. So
where does the term, you're giving away Paul Revere shirts. Well, let me tell you, twist my nipples and call me Susan. I can't wait for it.
Well, we're lucky. I was sponsored by a company called Liberty & Co. out of Pennsylvania. They make the most unique American Revolution shirts and products in general you're ever going to see. And 10% of the proceeds go to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia.
So let's talk about it. Where does the term militia come into play in American history? And when do you see the formation of one in this country?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure the exact, literary history of the word militia. I would assume it comes from some kind of mix of Roman or Greek. But we see militias arising in colonial America pretty much right off the bat. They were basically a necessity. When the first Europeans came over and started colonizing, well, they were little more than outposts. And every able-bodied citizen needed to participate in the defense of that said post. First of all, from, Native Americans who may have been hostile, but also, especially in British North America, from the French or the Spanish or any other nation at sea. And even pirates were common at this time and needed to be protected from. And then, over the 150 years between English Europeans coming to British North America and then the actual outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, they go from small enclaves of militia to colony-wide, and then after that, statewide, I'll say mini armies, if you will. But they were primarily run locally. And as I said, every able-bodied citizen's responsibility was to join the militia. Not everyone did, but you don't often see things like conscription with the militia. Sometimes during war that would be called into play. But generally speaking, it was your duty. It was your patriotic responsibility. And they used the term virtue at the time. A little bit different than we use the word virtue now. But they used the word virtue at the time, your public virtue. It was, you were being a kind of a jerk if you weren't going to join the militia and you could. What are you doing? Help us out. And interestingly, it's not really necessarily just for outwardly protection, it was also fairly common to be used as the police force. Generally, what would happen, much the way we do today, you would elect a sheriff for your community, and that sheriff would be responsible for enforcing any laws or warrants that were called in by your local community. But if it was a dangerous situation, you weren't necessarily going to go in by yourself, so you would call in the militia. Furthermore, the same thing would happen with the governor. If there was, we'll say, an insurrection of sorts, the militia was actually used to help police the bigger cities in town and towns.
So let's differentiate that for a minute. A lot of people are aware of the sheriff and how he's an elected official, and then he would go around and deputize people. But you're telling me that oftentimes when the job was even bigger than that, instead of getting his deputies together or just deputizing a few people, they would utilize this militia?
Yes. Now, again, the militia is essentially an army, but they were so small scale at the time, you wouldn't just... I know your audience and your particular show, we like to talk about what's happening now, and I would like to relate it to now, because I think this is important for the way we view our current, not just police system, but military system. But at the time, you wouldn't necessarily call in the whole militia to go arrest two dudes in a house who were accused of murder, but you could call in a few members of the militia to help you out when necessary. Now, again, the militia was primarily used for preventing outward attacks. And that's why when the American Revolutionary War breaks out, for example, and even up through the Second Amendment specifically mentions the militia. Now, I don't want to get into the argument if it's only for militia or not, but it does specifically mention that a militia is necessary to the security of a free people. And the reason for that is the people should go out and defend themselves. And if we are talking about inward policing, well, it's the same kind of attitude that we should be policing ourselves. And it's about your community and protecting your community. Of course, the militias were called in during the Revolution to fight off Britain, but generally the militias during the Revolutionary War, for example, were kept within the state. You did have the Continental Army that recruited from the separate states, but you also had, theoretically, the American Revolution was fought by about 15 or 16 separate armies. One for each state. The Continental Army, the French helped us out. Vermont and Kentucky were not states yet, but essentially had their own armies. But these, the people at the time were viewed it as defending themselves and fighting for their community. And the militias generally didn't leave their states. Sometimes they were called in by the Continental Army. They were called levies, where you were basically renting out your militia. But the militia was allowed to ignore that. If you were a militiaman and they said, it was, say, from Massachusetts, and they said, okay, we need you over in Virginia, you could say no. And there wasn't a lot you could do. Now, during the time, we were all on a team, and, for everyone did what George Washington asked in the name of unity for that particular cause.
What would you say was the percentage during the Revolutionary War that were actually militiamen that came in? Because you talk about well-regulated armies, that there was so many different armies at the time, and they were statewide run, but this was, obviously the revolutionary time that afterwards we'll actually have them in our Second Amendment. And I definitely want to go over the Second Amendment with you. How many people were in the militia and part of the revolution?
Well, that number I don't know particularly, but what I can tell you is at the time, there was about 2.5 million people living in British North America, as I like to call it at the time, the revolutionary states, so to speak. Now, of that 2.5 million people, 500,000 were slaves. So while I certainly don't want to exclude human beings, they were not generally part of the militia. When you really narrow it down, you see people with those three Roman numeral 3 signs on their cars for the 3%. When you really break it down, it was approximately only 3% of people ever served with the patriots. So Washington's army never seems to have surpassed 30,000 people. Granted, throughout the 8 years of war, some people left when their enlistments ended, new people came in. If I had to approximate, it would probably be about half of Washington's usual number of about 15 to 20,000. So probably about 10 to 20,000, maybe 30,000 people throughout 8 years of war. And that's an estimation. I don't have the numbers in front of me. It is fairly difficult to get exact numbers, although they did keep extraordinary records for the time, which is one of the things I appreciate about the American founders the most, is they told us what the history is. We can just go read it from them. But like I said, I have not gone over those specific lists. That's a lot of counting to do. I haven't done it specifically, but that's my estimation.
But I mean, that's a significant amount. Basically, it is not likely that we could have won the Revolutionary War, a guerrilla war, without these militiamen, without these people without uniforms, without these well-regulated armies, as you've called them, that were coming from communities and neighborhoods. And that's where I'd like to transition into the Second Amendment, what you think it might mean.
Absolutely, but I do want to interrupt one thing real quick. There were also loyalist militias. So you had militias at the time, but when the Revolutionary War breaks out, you have patriot militias fighting against Great Britain, but you also have loyalist militias fighting in the name of the king, the only government they'd ever known. But most of those people had trained in the same militias. It's interesting. We often talk about the Civil War as a brother versus brother war, which it was, but the American Revolution, the Civil War was primarily North versus South, but the American Revolutionary War was literally, there are parents who side with the king and children who fight with their dads. You know what I mean? But because these people were trained in the local militia, they knew how to drill. They knew how to be an army. So when the situation arose that they needed to choose a side, they were ready to choose a side. So anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a great point, because like you said, a lot of people go to the Civil War and they don't understand that there were even those then that were comfortable with their living situation. Some would call it tyranny. Some might call it tyranny today. And so much so that even in these groups, they did not go to the revolutionary side, but instead sided with the redcoats. However, it didn't work out for the redcoats. And that's where we get the United States of America eventually from these documents. And what is highly contested today is what that Second Amendment actually means. Now, some people say, well, it says well-regulated militia, so we should have every tool that the U.S. government and military have. Some would argue that the Second Amendment is for hunting. I would argue that's obviously not why they put militia in there. But what, in your estimation, was the original intention of the Second Amendment, and what are your thoughts on it today?
Well, I do want to note that on my channel, we speak about history and only history, so I don't give my personal opinion over there. So don't let my opinion here turn you away from that if you're interested in American history. I will say that at the time, first of all, the Bill of Rights was written 3 years after the Constitution, because when the Constitution was written, and many anti-federalists, and I write a lot about anti-federalists who did not like the Constitution itself, which I know sounds very controversial today. But one of the main arguments of anti-federalists is that they had left out any Bill of Rights. But one of the things the Constitution's authors had said was, well, all of the states have bills of rights. Why would we need to declare that? And also, isn't it super obvious? And many of the anti-federalists said, no, it's not obvious. Let's write it down. And that's kind of one of the after Constitution compromise was the Bill of Rights, and where they had to write down things like, okay, the federal government cannot do this. And at the time when they wrote it down, it was, no, the federal government cannot take it away. I mean, yeah, you can go hunting, but it was for self-defense. And they do specifically say the rights of the free people. Now, I'm sorry, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the right of a free people. They did absolutely believe that. It would be difficult for someone to say, however, that that's all they meant, because they do specifically say the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It's also a little deceiving to say something like they couldn't necessarily imagine the weapons we have today, because what's interesting about the American Revolution, it takes place at the peak of the Enlightenment as the Enlightenment age is transitioning into the Industrial Revolution. So they did see a lot of what could happen, and they literally saw it happening. I mean, you have Ben Franklin came up with the word electron because his studies with electricity. Like, they see the scientific revolution coming. In fact, Paul Revere, we mentioned, doesn't get a lot of credit for after the war helping initialize like mass production, but that's a different story. But either way, they could see some of the things that were coming. Machine guns. Some of them kind of figured that was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Problem gets into, and again, this is not something this is a personal opinion. The problem seems to be when you get into things like nuclear explosions.
Or tanks,
Or tanks. So, first of all, the submarine was invented during the American Revolution.
Okay.
So they did see some of this coming. They could see, like, they didn't have armored tanks, but they could see outfitting a horse with some armor. Not to negate what you said, Burmis. It's a good point. They definitely couldn't see the tanks we have today. You know what I mean? They definitely couldn't see a submarine running on nuclear fusion. They had a submarine with a hose going up to the surface. So, like, if we really, like, and I know when I use the word nuclear, people say, well, that's not really bearing arms. But, we called it an arms race during the Cold War for 60 years. So
any technology that can be utilized for a military purpose, whether it's nuclear, whether it's even laser technology, which has now gone public and they're knocking things out of the sky with that concentrated technology. I suppose if you took the original interpretation, you could argue for. But as you said, despite the fact that these guys were on the verge of that industrial revolution, they were only getting glimpses at it. So, I would say this. What are your thoughts on how the militia, both past and now present, has been portrayed? And what do you think the timeline of that change in perception is and why?
Well, that's an extremely interesting question with 250 years worth of answers. I do think that, and again, I'm not in any way a student of the Civil War in the same fashion I am of the American Revolution through the War of 1812. But like I said, for the defense of the nation, especially before you have airplanes and helicopters and like missiles that travel hundreds of miles, they were extraordinarily important for the defense of the nation. Unfortunately, I think after the Civil War, the whole idea of like protecting yourself from the federal government starts to be like not acceptable anymore. And then by the time you get through World War I and World War II, they're not gone. Like, I know there are still militias today. I understand that. But they're not nearly as common as they used to be. And nowadays it's more, if you're going to do something like that, you join the Army or one of the other branches of the United States government, which is fine. I have no real opinion on people doing that. We need an army, in my opinion, to some degree. Again, my opinion. But unfortunately, I can't comment too strongly because I'm not in a militia. Now, in my opinion, should militias be more common? Personally, I absolutely think so. I would love to have the opportunity to join the militia and have my children join the militia and have all able-bodied citizens, which in the American Revolution, the word they used was citizen, despite the fact that most able-bodied people were not citizens. But nowadays, we should use the word citizen, and able-bodied citizens should have access. Honestly, I haven't talked about this with many people in my own personal thinking, though. We still have armories around. Like, ours is now used as a museum of natural history. Mm-hmm. But, we back before the plague hit, we were having a little bit of a gun violence problem there. And in my opinion, one of the major ways to solve that would to be create militias where people could have the opportunity to learn how to properly arm themselves and use the weapons. They could properly store the weapons so that, when we talk about certain high-powered weapons, and trust me, I understand what semi-automatic means. I understand it's just how the gun reloads. It's not like you're blah, 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 blasting bullets like that. I understand that. But certain weapons, as we said, nuclear weapons, and I think that carries down to certain personal weapons, like, I don't think people can walk around with a missile launcher on their shoulder necessarily. But there are definitely people watching this that disagree with me on that, and that's fine. It's a totally reasonable opinion to think I should be able to buy a nuclear weapon. Like, why not? It's the Second Amendment, right? And now I don't disagree with that. And a missile launcher is not a nuclear weapon, but if we had armories that were guarded by 3 or 4 local members of the militia and was well regulated where and when you could practice with that weapon, then I think that would give the opportunity for people who wanted to learn how to use a missile launcher the opportunity to use and practice with one in a safe environment, and it would be regulated as long as we have enough guards at the armory to make sure who's taking it out and it's getting put back in. And what we would do is exactly what they did back during the American Revolution with their militia. Everyone could join the militia, but to be an officer of that militia, you were generally, and every state was different, generally elected or appointed by the local government or the state government who oversaw the appointments and were elected themselves by the people. And this would be an organized way, just as it used to be, an organized way to give the people access to training and arms to secure themselves without necessarily just throwing the guns around like we do now. And say, protect yourself. Because honestly, dude, like, you're not going to protect yourself from the feds.
Well, again, that's the point, is that this is in place to oppose a tyrannical government that's no longer giving you due process. And of course, that was only one of the arguments in those revolutionary times. I don't want to put you on the spot too hard here because obviously that's where your expertise lies. But can you kind of point to an instance later on or in modern history, one of the last instances that the federal government did call on the militia for help? I mean, are we talking late 1800s, early 1900s? When does that seem to dissipate?
When did they actually call on the militia? That's an extraordinary question. I will probably not know because it's probably a really cool moment. I would suggest my inclination would be sometime during the Native American hostilities in the Southwest. Mm-hmm. There were certain instances about the years between 1900 and 1910, which is when Arizona and New Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, both joined the Union in 1907. Don't quote me on that, but it's sometime around there. They came in really late. And it's because we were still having hostilities down there. And I wouldn't necessarily say the federal government called in the militia, but the militias lasted longest out in the Northwest and the Southwest because they were the last ones to be, I guess the word would be...
acclimated?
Colonized.
Colonized, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Reined in.
I mean, let's be honest. It was a brutal time. People have to understand that the frontier very much was. They don't call it the Wild Wild West for no reason, and that these places were being colonized, sometimes violently. But at the same time, if you look at your history, it's not like the Native Americans weren't brutal either. And I think people get lost in that altogether. Those arguments, but we're not trying to go there. This is the militia talk.
No, you're not wrong. But when we speak about Native Americans, we always want to keep in mind that they viewed themselves as many separate nations. And while some Native Americans could absolutely be a lot more hostile than others, some of them were peaceful the whole time. For example, a lot of people don't realize this. The Lenape tribe, which we generally call Delaware today, though they did not live in Delaware by the time of the American Revolution, had moved to the Ohio region outside Pennsylvania. They were actually considered to be the 14th state, a Native American state, because they were so friendly with the Native Americans in the Continental Congress, and they were on such good terms. There was a leader whose name was White Eyes, who was almost basically named governor, and before Vermont got to be the 14th state, they almost made this area of Ohio into a Native American state. Now, there were some miscommunications with certain generals and
miscommunications.
No, actually, they were, like I said, they were super friendly, man. So I believe it was Brigadier General Edward Hand. And if I'm mistaken, I feel really guilty. What I do on Founder of the Day for your viewers, I go through it. I write 5 articles a week about a different American founder. I just about to hit 900 in 2 years. So you'll forgive me if I confuse a brigadier general here or a colonel there.
I think you're doing great, Jay.
I did want to note, before we go, I don't want to cut you off, but I did want to note, we talk about the militia in modern politics, and well, at least in these circles with you, we talk about the militia as if it could always protect from the federal government. But one of the actual arguments on behalf of the the Federalists who wanted the Constitution, they would actually criticize things like New York, for example. And I know many of your conservative audience will say, oh, liberal New York. During the American Revolution, New York was a swing state. That's why the Federalist Papers were written in New York to the people of New York. That's how they were addressed, because New York was a swing state. At that point, it was the fourth most powerful state, only fourth out of 13, but it was necessary to get New York on board. And one of their major criticisms was the anti-federalists would say, why do you need a powerful army? We have a militia. And it's like, well, but in the Constitution, we have certain regulations on how we can use this army, as opposed to New York State, where Governor George Clinton could just call out the militia and theoretically invade his neighbors or suppress the people of New York. So actually, there was an argument being made at the beginning that the Constitution protected people from the militia. And furthermore, I should also note that there was another argument during the constitutional ratification debates in 1787, 1788, where they were saying, hey, why do we need a standing army? Because remember, when we talk about the American Revolution, we often think they hated a standing army. But no, the Constitution was written, one of the several reasons was for a standing army. And we like to pretend a lot of times nowadays that, we have the Second Amendment to prevent a standing army. No. We have the Constitution for a standing army. And a major reason was when we had borders, like Pittsburgh was a border with not only Native American tribes, but Spain, who helped us a little during the Revolution, but they had the Mississippi River, and they were one of the most powerful nations in the world. And just north of that, above the Great Lakes, we had Great Britain. And who do you want protecting your shores from British regulars and Spanish regulars? Well-trained army. Do you want some soldiers who train every other weekend and take 2 weeks out of their summer to sit in the fort? Or do you want soldiers who are there ready to protect you from invasion? And I personally, I probably would have been an anti-federalist if I were alive back then. Spoiler alert. But it's a really interesting argument that is hard to argue. As someone who would really like to argue against that, I just like to point that out when we talk about militia, because it is interesting.
Jay Mandresh, everybody, he is the founder of the day. We got to start getting him on at least once a month. I was pressing him last week and we couldn't do it, and we ended up doing it this week. But especially with
give a shout out to you, Jay Burmis. If it weren't for you, Founder of the Day would not be the high quality program it is right now, because Jason has helped me out tremendously when it comes to I'm a book nerd, and that computer nerd. Oh, he's over here. Sorry, that computer nerd has helped me tremendously also become a computer nerd. So thank you, Jason, for all your support.
Well, of course, man, I want to see your channel grow. I think it's important. I think you have a great historical perspective. It's good to know that people like you exist. I'm going to have you back on, not only about the militia, but whatever we see foment in the Supreme Court via this election, which I believe eventually we'll get there. Who knows what the rulings are going to be? But I suspect it's going to be before the Electoral College meets. Maybe not. Maybe it's going to be post-Electoral College. Maybe that's the show we do. But we definitely got to get together before Christmas, get your take on historical elections, the Electoral College, and what we're seeing today via these elections.
I'm happy to talk about the Electoral College.
What?
Oh, it's all wrong right now. Just real quick. You know how we have the term faithless elector?
Yes.
You know how you hear the term faithless elector, and like states have outlawed the idea, like certain states, the electors have to vote with the party. And meanwhile, we go to the polling booth and we check off, Joe Biden or Donald Trump. You're not voting for Biden or Trump. You're voting for a representative to go vote for you. And the reason they set up the Electoral College was not to balance out the states or this and that. It's because you are not smart enough to vote for president. And I believe it's Federalist 65. I might have the numbers twist. One of the Federalist papers in the 60s, because there's 86 of them, or 85 of them. Alexander Hamilton specifically states that, I'll paraphrase here, I can't quote the whole thing.
It's basically, he states that these people are not informed enough.
I'm sorry?
He states that these people are not informed enough and that they don't have a grasp because that information cannot travel as quickly. They don't have access to newspapers. They don't have access to these scholarly articles that are going on, the actual debates that are happening. And in the case that, yeah.
They also don't have access to TV or Twitter.
Yeah.
So the idea is, like, if you own property, well, you're smart enough to vote, but not on president. You can vote for the smartest person in your community to go to the Capitol and vote on your behalf. And there's a little bit of an appeal to that, though, because they could actually meet these people. Donald Trump wasn't on TV back then. You had to go shake hands and meet Donald Trump. And if you met Donald Trump, Joe, I don't care who, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
if you met John Adams, you could be like, this guy's kind of an idiot. Why is he even here? I'm going to be a faithless elector because I was sent to represent my people. So the idea of faithless electors is actually something that the writers of the Constitution really, really admired.
All right. Save it for in a couple weeks. Maybe we'll do it on the day the Electoral College is supposed to meet, but we're going to stay in touch. I want everybody to go check out founderoftheday.com. I want you to check out the YouTube channel. I want you to go subscribe. Can we get them 100 more subscribers today? Let's make that happen, Cap'n. And join you in about an hour and a half for trivia, right?
Hour and a half. 8:15 Eastern Standard Time. And can I give a shout out to TJ, who is one of my supporters that found me through the last time I was on the show. Hi, TJ.
Awesome. All right, there he is, folks. Jay Mandresh. We're going to be keeping in touch. Thank you so much, Jay. I want to remind everybody that we are fully demonetized on this channel. $5, $10, $15 means the world to me. Big donors. I couldn't do it without you. Remember to Rockfin. Did I mention to Rockfin? Yes. Please go sign up for free at Rockfin Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. We do it live and free. Lots of exclusives over there. If you support me premium, you get all the premium content from Whitney Webb, who did my show today. You get all the premium content from Sloan Newsday, from Jimmy Dore, from Ben Askren, from John Fitch, Kim Iverson, Nico House, The Convo Couch, and so many more. Check out all the documentary films, Loose Change, Final Cut, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire, A New World Order to Find, and Shade the Motion Picture for free right here, right now. Thumbs it up. Subscribe, share. I absolutely love you guys, and I'll see you on the flip side.